The massive space station called Harmony Prime floated in the darkness between stars like a giant metal flower. Its silver petals stretched out for miles in every direction, and each petal held thousands of beings from across the galaxy. Today was special because representatives from over 200 different alien species had come together for the annual Universal Law Review. Captain Jake Morrison walked through the main corridor and felt small compared to the towering walls around him. The human delegation was tiny compared to most others. Only 3 humans had come to represent their entire species, while some alien groups brought hundreds of members. Jake wore his best blue uniform, but still felt underdressed next to the glowing robes and crystal armor of the other species. Lisa Grant walked beside him carrying a thick folder of documents. She was the best legal mind Earth had to offer, and she had spent months preparing for this meeting. Her job was to make sure humanity followed all the galactic laws properly. Ryan Scott brought up the rear of their small group. He was supposed to help other species understand human culture, but most aliens found humans very confusing. The corridor led them to the great assembly hall, which was so large that clouds actually formed near the ceiling. Thousands of seats arranged in perfect circles faced a central platform where speakers would present their cases. Each species had their own section, and the humans were given seats in the back corner. This did not surprise Jake, because humanity had only joined the Galactic Federation 50 years ago, and they were still considered newcomers. The Zephyrian delegation sat in the front row, and their leader, Chancellor Vex 9, stood up to begin the meeting. The Zephyrians looked like tall, thin people made of blue metal, and they spoke in musical tones that everyone could understand through translation devices. Vex 9 had been running these meetings for over 300 years, and he did not like changes to the old ways. Behind the Zephyrians sat the crystalline collective, and their bodies looked like walking diamonds that caught and reflected light in beautiful patterns. They never spoke as individuals, but always as one voice representing their entire species. Next to them were the insect-like beings from the Hive Queens, who moved together like a single organism and thought with one shared mind. Jake noticed that most of the alien species seemed very similar in how they acted, even though they looked completely different. They all moved in perfect coordination with their own kind and never seemed to disagree about anything important. Their societies ran like perfectly built machines where every part knew exactly what to do. Vex 9 began speaking about the purpose of today's meeting. The Galactic Federation operated under something called the Cosmic Code, which was a set of universal laws that had kept peace in the galaxy for over 3,000 years. These laws were designed to prevent chaos and make sure all species could live together without conflict. The Chancellor explained that they needed to review some old laws and remove any practices that might cause problems. He said that some younger species still followed primitive customs that could be dangerous to galactic harmony. When he said this, Jake noticed that many alien eyes turned to look at the human section. Lisa leaned over to whisper to Jake that she had a bad feeling about where this was going. She had studied the Federation laws carefully and knew that humans did many things differently than other species. Most aliens had evolved beyond what they called wasteful individual thinking, and instead made all decisions based on what was best for their entire species. Vex 9 continued his speech and said that the Federation had identified something they called the human paradox. This was their term for humanity's strange insistence on letting individual people make their own choices, even when those choices were not the most logical or efficient ones possible. Every other species in the galaxy had found ways to eliminate this problem, but humans seemed to celebrate it. The Chancellor brought up examples of human behavior that confused other species. Humans chose careers based on personal interest rather than genetic optimization. They formed relationships based on emotional attraction rather than genetic compatibility. They spent enormous amounts of time and resources on activities like art and music and literature that served no practical survival purpose. Ryan tried to explain that these things were important to human culture, but his words were translated poorly, and many aliens began making sounds that Jake assumed were laughter. The Crystalline Collective responded that they had eliminated all such inefficiencies from their society millions of years ago and had achieved perfect productivity as a result. Shard-Prime-7 spoke for the Crystallines and said that human unpredictability made them dangerous to work with. How could other species make proper plans when humans might suddenly change their minds for emotional reasons? The Hive Queen representative, Zach, agreed and demonstrated how her species had removed individual choice 3 million years ago, which resulted in zero conflict and maximum efficiency. Jake felt his heart sink as he realized what was happening. The Federation was preparing to force humanity to change its most basic values or face consequences. Vex 9 announced that they would be voting on whether to add freedom of suboptimal choice to the official list of prohibited practices throughout the galaxy. The debate continued for hours as species after species stood up to explain why individual choice was primitive and dangerous. Jake knew that humanity was facing its greatest challenge since joining the galactic community, and the outcome would determine whether humans could remain true to themselves or would be forced to become something else entirely. The second day of the assembly focused entirely on what the aliens called the human problem. Jake Morrison sat in his assigned seat and watched as species after species stood up to explain why human behavior was dangerous to galactic civilization. Each presentation made him feel more isolated and defensive about his own people. Dr. Helen Carter had arrived overnight from Earth to help defend humanity's position. She was a small woman with gray hair and kind eyes, but Jake knew she had one of the sharpest minds on the planet. Her job was to explain human philosophy to beings who had never experienced individual choice, and she faced an almost impossible task. Chancellor VEX9 called her to the central platform, and the entire assembly fell silent. Helen walked slowly to the speaking area and looked up at thousands of alien faces staring down at her. The translation device amplified her voice, so everyone could hear her words in their own languages. Helen began by thanking the assembly for allowing her to speak. She said that humans were honored to be part of the galactic community and wanted to find ways to work together peacefully. But she also said that some things were so fundamental to human nature that changing them would destroy what made humans valuable to the galaxy. Shard-Prime-7 interrupted her and asked why humans insisted on maintaining the right to make bad decisions. The crystalline representative explained that his species had solved this problem by programming each individual to always choose the most logical option. Their society had achieved perfect efficiency, and no crystalline had ever made a mistake. In over 2 million years, Helen tried to explain that humans believed mistakes were necessary for growth and learning. She said that when people were free to fail, they also became free to discover new possibilities that programmed minds could never imagine. The audience made sounds of confusion because most aliens could not understand why anyone would want the freedom to fail. Hive Queen Zach spoke next, and her voice carried the weight of billions of connected minds. She said that individual choice had been eliminated from her species so long ago that they could barely remember what it felt like. Every drone in the hive knew exactly what to do at every moment, because they were all connected to the same central intelligence. This had created perfect harmony and eliminated all conflict within their society. Helen asked Zach what happened when the hive encountered problems that required new solutions. The Hive Queen paused for a long moment before admitting that her species rarely faced truly new problems because they avoided situations that might require unprogrammed responses. Helen pointed out that this meant they had also eliminated the possibility of making great discoveries or achieving unexpected breakthroughs. The Faerun, Empire Representative War Commander Steel Talon, stood up next. His species looked like metallic warriors, and they had achieved peace by surrendering all individual will to their military command structure. Every Faerun citizen followed orders without question, and their society had not experienced war or crime for millions of years. Steel Talon argued that choice led to conflict, and conflict led to destruction. He said that humans were proof of this, because Earth had experienced countless wars throughout its history. Only by eliminating individual decision-making could any species achieve true peace and stability. Helen responded that human wars had also led to rapid technological advancement and cultural growth. She said that the competition between different ideas and the freedom to pursue different paths had made humans one of the fastest developing species in galactic history. In just 50 years since joining the Federation, humans had made contributions to science and art that had taken other species centuries to achieve. Elder Sage Wisdom of Ages spoke for the Council of Ancient Races. His species was so old that they had forgotten their original name and appearance. They existed as pure energy beings who had transcended physical form millions of years ago. Wisdom of Ages said that all young species went through a chaotic phase before learning to control their primitive impulses. The Elder explained that choice was an evolutionary stage that mature species eventually outgrew. He said that humans would naturally develop beyond their current state if given enough time, but the galaxy could not wait for this slow process. Other species needed predictable partners, and human unpredictability made them unsuitable for important galactic projects. Helen asked the Elder what his species had accomplished in the last million years. Wisdom of Ages paused and said that they had achieved perfect stability and harmony. Helen pointed out that this sounded more like stagnation than achievement and asked if perfect beings ever discovered anything new or created anything beautiful. Questions seemed to disturb many of the assembled aliens. Most species had spent so long eliminating chaos from their societies that they had forgotten what progress felt like. They measured success by how little change occurred rather than by how much they accomplished. Dr. Helen Carter walked closer to the center of the platform and spoke directly to the assembly. She said that humans had studied the histories of many galactic species and noticed a troubling pattern. Most civilizations seemed to reach a point where they stopped growing and started focusing only on maintaining what they already had. She proposed that choice was not a problem to be solved, but a tool for continued evolution. Human societies that allowed the most individual freedom also showed the most rapid advancement in science and culture. The chaos that other species feared was actually the source of creativity and innovation. Chancellor Vex 9 responded that the Federation valued stability over innovation. He said that the cosmic code had maintained peace for 3,000 years, and any changes to this system could lead to galactic war. The risk of allowing human chaos to spread was too great to accept. Debate continued through the day as more species shared their concerns about human unpredictability. Jake listened to speaker after speaker explained why his people needed to change their fundamental nature. He began to understand that this was not really about laws or efficiency, but about fear. The other species were afraid that human ways might somehow contaminate their perfect societies. As the session ended, Vex 9 announced that the final vote would take place tomorrow. He said that humanity had one last chance to present their case before the Federation decided whether to force them to eliminate individual choice or face expulsion from the galactic community. Jake looked around at the thousands of alien faces and realized that most had already made up their minds. Tomorrow would determine whether humans could remain human while still being part of the larger galaxy, or whether they would have to choose between their identity and their place among the stars. The emergency meeting on Earth took place in the Global Council chambers beneath the city of New Geneva. President Nathan Cole sat at the head of a long table, surrounded by the most important leaders of humanity. The holographic display showed live feeds from Harmony Prime, where the debate about human nature continued without them. General Patricia Hayes slammed her fist on the table and said that humanity should withdraw from the Federation immediately. She argued that no alliance was worth giving up everything that made humans unique. Her military advisors nodded in agreement, and several began discussing defensive strategies in case the aliens tried to force compliance. Dr. Richard Stone disagreed with the general and said that leaving the Federation would isolate humanity from the rest of the galaxy. He pointed out that humans had learned enormous amounts from alien science and technology in just 50 years. Cutting off that relationship would slow human progress by centuries and leave Earth vulnerable to species that might not be as peaceful as the Federation. President Cole listened to both arguments, but knew that neither option was acceptable. Humanity could not survive alone against hundreds of advanced alien civilizations, but they also could not abandon the principles that had driven their rapid advancement. There had to be a third choice that no one had considered yet. Meanwhile, on Harmony Prime, Lisa Grant was working through the night in the Federation archives. She had access to historical records going back millions of years, and she was looking for any information that might help humanity's case. Most of the data was about laws and treaties and trade agreements, but she noticed something strange in the older files. The records showed that the galaxy had once been home to many more species than existed today. Hundreds of civilizations had risen to great heights before disappearing completely. Lisa assumed they had been destroyed by wars or natural disasters, but when she looked closer, she found no evidence of violence or catastrophe. Each extinct species had followed the same pattern. They had joined the Federation and adopted the cosmic code and achieved perfect stability and efficiency. Their societies had eliminated all sources of chaos and conflict. Then, after a few million years of perfect harmony, they had simply faded away, leaving only empty worlds and silent space stations. Lisa called Jake with her discovery, and he immediately saw the implications. The Federation was not just trying to control human behavior, but was unconsciously following a pattern that had killed hundreds of species. The pursuit of perfect order was actually a path to extinction, disguised as enlightenment. At the same time, young anthropologist Emma White was making her own breakthrough in a different part of the archives. She had been studying the original documents that created the Federation and found something that shocked her. The first version of the cosmic code had been written by a species called the architects, who had disappeared long before any current Federation member existed. Emma discovered that the original cosmic code was designed to prevent the abuse of choice rather than eliminate choice itself. The architects had wanted to stop powerful individuals from making decisions that harmed entire populations. But over millions of years, the interpretation had gradually changed as species became more afraid of any kind of unpredictability. She found records of debates from thousands of years ago where Federation members had argued about whether to allow artistic expression or scientific experimentation that might lead to unexpected results. Each generation had chosen slightly more control and slightly less freedom until the current system emerged that eliminated individual choice entirely. Emma shared her findings with Lisa, and together they began to piece together the true history of the galaxy. The Federation had not created peace and stability, but had instead created a slow form of cultural suicide that destroyed species through stagnation rather than violence. Back on Earth, President Cole was receiving updates from both teams of researchers. The information changed everything because it meant that humanity was not just fighting for their own survival, but potentially for the survival of every species in the galaxy. The Federation's perfect system was actually a trap that led to extinction. Dr. Richard Stone proposed a radical new approach. Instead of defending human chaos or trying to find a compromise with Federation law, they should challenge the entire foundation of the galactic system. If they could prove that the cosmic code was killing civilizations, then other species might be willing to consider alternatives. General Hayes was skeptical because she did not believe that aliens who had followed the same system for millions of years would be willing to change based on human arguments. She pointed out that most Federation species had invested their entire identities in the belief that they had achieved perfection through eliminating choice. President Cole decided to take the biggest gamble in human history. He authorized Jake Morrison to present not just a defense of human law, but a complete challenge to the Federation's fundamental beliefs. This approach could either save humanity or result in immediate expulsion and possible military action against Earth. Jake received his new instructions and felt the weight of his entire species on his shoulders. He would have to convince thousands of aliens that everything they believed about civilization was wrong, and that the chaotic humans actually held the key to galactic survival. Dr. Helen Carter worked with Emma White and Lisa Grant to prepare a presentation that would shock the Federation Assembly. They gathered evidence of extinct civilizations and traced the gradual corruption of the original cosmic code. Most importantly, they prepared to show that human advancement was not despite their chaos, but because of it. The night before the final vote, Jake stood on the observation deck of Harmony Prime and looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there were the empty worlds of hundreds of species that had chosen perfect order over continued growth. Tomorrow he would find out whether the current galactic civilization was wise enough to learn from their mistakes. Ryan Scott joined him at the viewing court and said that he had been talking to younger members of various alien delegations. Many of them had privately expressed curiosity about human ways and admitted that their own societies sometimes felt restrictive and boring. The desire for something more than perfect efficiency existed, even among species that had supposedly eliminated it. Jake realized that humanity's greatest strength might not be their arguments or evidence, but their example. For 50 years, humans had been demonstrating that chaos and choice could coexist with progress and cooperation. Some aliens were beginning to wonder what they had given up in exchange for their perfect societies. Tomorrow would determine whether that wonder was strong enough to overcome millions of years of conditioning, or whether humanity would stand alone against the galaxy in defense of the simple right to choose their own path forward. Jake Morrison stood before the great assembly with his heart pounding and his mouth dry. Thousands of alien eyes focused on him as he prepared to make the most important speech in human history. Behind him, Dr. Helen Carter and Emma White had arranged displays showing the evidence they had discovered about extinct civilizations and the corrupted cosmic code. Instead of defending human law, Jake began by congratulating the Federation on achieving something remarkable. He said that never before in galactic history had so many different species managed to coexist peacefully for such a long time. The cosmic code had indeed prevented wars and conflicts that might have destroyed entire civilizations. This unexpected opening confused many delegates who had expected Jake to attack their system. Chancellor Vex 9 interrupted to ask where this line of reasoning was leading, since everyone already knew the Federation was successful. Jake smiled and said that he wanted to explore what success really meant. He asked the assembly to consider whether a civilization that never changed could truly be called alive. The holographic displays began showing images of empty worlds where great species had once thrived before disappearing into perfect silence. Evidence was overwhelming. Species after species had joined the Federation and adopted the cosmic code and achieved perfect stability before vanishing completely. Jake pointed out that these extinctions had not been caused by war or disaster, but by the gradual elimination of everything that made life worth living. Shard-Prime-7 objected that the crystalline collective had been following Federation law for millions of years without any signs of decline. Jake asked when the crystallines had last made a great discovery, or created something beautiful, or solved the problem in a completely new way. The crystal being paused for a long moment before admitting that such things were not part of their program. Functions. Jake proposed something that shocked the assembly. Instead of forcing humanity to abandon their chaotic ways, what if the Federation tried a limited experiment? They could select a few failing colonies from different species and introduce human-style choice protocols to see what happened. The suggestion caused an uproar among the delegates. War Commander Steel Talon declared that allowing chaos into ordered societies would lead to immediate disaster. Hive Queen Zack said that individual choice was a form of mental illness that could spread like a disease if not contained. But Jake had done his research, and he knew which colonies were struggling. The Zephyrian Research Station, on the edge of the galaxy, had not made a significant discovery in over 1,000 years. The crystalline mining operation in the Andromeda sector was producing less each year despite having perfect efficiency. The Hive Queen agricultural world was seeing declining crop yields, even though every drone followed optimal procedures. Dr. Richard Stone had provided Jake with detailed analysis of why these colonies were failing. Perfect systems could not adapt to changing conditions, and when environments shifted even slightly, the rigid protocols broke down. The colonies were dying slowly because they could not innovate solutions to new problems. Chancellor VEX9 was intrigued despite his reservations. He said that if humans were so confident in their chaotic methods, they should be willing to stake their Federation membership on the results. If the experiment failed, humanity would accept immediate expulsion and agree never to contact other species again. Jake felt the weight of his decision, but knew that humanity had to take this risk. He agreed to the terms, and the Assembly voted to approve a limited 6-month trial. Human advisors would be allowed to work with the 3 failing colonies to introduce choice protocols, while Federation observers monitored every change. The selection of human advisors caused another debate. Some aliens wanted only scientists and engineers, but Jake insisted that the team include artists and philosophers and people from various backgrounds. He said that the whole point was to show how different perspectives could solve problems in unexpected ways. Dr. Helen Carter volunteered to lead the team working with the Hive Queen agricultural world. She said that teaching individual choice to beings who had shared consciousness for millions of years would be the ultimate test of human methods. Ryan Scott asked to work with the crystalline mining operation because he was fascinated by the challenge of introducing creativity to a species that valued only logic. White chose the Zephyrian Research Station because she wanted to show how combining unrelated fields of study could lead to breakthrough discoveries. Jake would coordinate between all 3 locations and report progress to the Federation Assembly. The journey to the experimental colonies took several weeks, and Jake used the time to prepare his human team for what they would face. Most aliens had never made a personal decision in their entire lives, and the concept of choosing based on preference rather than programming would be completely foreign to them. When they arrived at the Zephyrian Research Station, Jake was amazed by its size and complexity. Thousands of blue metallic beings worked in perfect coordination, conducting experiments that had been planned centuries in advance. Every detail was optimized for maximum efficiency, and every researcher knew exactly what they were supposed to accomplish. Emma began by asking the Zephyrian scientists what they were personally curious about. The question confused them because curiosity was not part of their programming. She explained that humans often made discoveries by pursuing questions that seemed unimportant or unrelated to their assigned tasks. At first, the Zephyrians resisted. Emma's suggestions because following personal interests seemed wasteful and illogical. But gradually, a few brave individuals began admitting that they had wondered about things outside their designated research areas. Emma encouraged them to spend some time each day exploring these questions, even if they seemed unproductive. The results were slow at first, but Jake began to notice changes. Zephyrian researchers started talking to each other about their side projects and sharing ideas across different departments. Some began combining techniques from unrelated fields and asking questions that no one had thought to ask before. Meanwhile, at the crystalline mining operation, Ryan Scott was having similar success. He convinced some workers to try different approaches to their tasks based on what interested them rather than what their programming dictated. The crystallines who took creative approaches to mining began finding new deposits and developing more efficient extraction methods. Dr. Helen Carter faced the biggest challenge at the Hive Queen agricultural world because the drones had to overcome millions of years of conditioning to think as individuals. She started by asking simple questions about what each drone observed in their daily work and encouraging them to make small decisions about how to handle unexpected situations. After 3 months, the changes were becoming obvious to everyone. The experimental colonies were not collapsing into chaos as predicted, but were instead showing signs of innovation and growth that had been absent for centuries. Production was increasing, and new discoveries were being made as individuals began thinking outside their programmed limitations. But not everyone in the Federation was pleased with these results, and Jake began to hear rumors of a coalition forming to end the experiment by force before it could spread to other worlds. War Commander Steel Talon paced back and forth in his private chambers aboard the Ferrum battleship Iron Discipline. The reports from the experimental colonies disturbed him more than any enemy attack ever had. Individual choice was spreading like a virus and threatening the perfect order that his species had maintained for millions of years. He called an emergency meeting of the Coalition for Galactic Stability, which included representatives from the most traditional species in the Federation. Elder Sage Wisdom of Ages appeared as a shimmering energy form, while Chancellor Vex9 attended via hologram from Harmony Prime. Several other species leaders joined them to discuss what they saw as a growing threat to civilization. Steel Talon began the meeting by showing surveillance footage from the experimental colonies. Zephyrian researchers were pursuing random interests instead of following their assigned tasks. Crystalline workers were making unauthorized modifications to mining equipment. Most shocking of all, Hive Queen drones were acting as individuals and making personal decisions without consulting the collective consciousness. The war commander argued that this chaos would destroy the careful balance that had kept peace in the galaxy for thousands of years. He said that once beings started thinking for themselves, they would inevitably come into conflict with each other and wars would follow. The only solution was to end the experiment immediately and quarantine any individuals who had been contaminated by human ideas. Elder Sage Wisdom of Ages agreed that the situation was dangerous, but urged caution in dealing with it. He pointed out that the Federation had built its reputation on following proper procedures and due process. Simply attacking the experimental colonies would make them appear no better than the chaotic humans they were trying to control. Chancellor VEX9 was torn between his fear of change and his commitment to Federation law. The experiment had been approved by proper vote, and the terms clearly stated that it would run for 6 months. Ending it early without just cause would undermine the legal system that held the Federation together. But Steel Talon had no patience for legal niceties when he believed galactic civilization was at stake. He began mobilizing the Ferrum fleet and contacted allied species to build a military coalition. His plan was to surround the experimental colonies and prevent the spread of individual choice by force if necessary. Meanwhile, on Earth, President Nathan Cole was receiving increasingly alarming reports from Federation space. Intelligence sources confirmed that several military fleets were moving toward the experimental colonies and preparing for possible armed intervention. Admiral Kevin Brooks was ordered to deploy the human fleet to protect the colonies and human advisors working there. Crisis escalated when young members of various alien species began requesting permission to visit the experimental colonies. Word had spread through unofficial channels about the innovations and discoveries being made by individuals who were free to follow their own interests. For the first time in millions of years, some aliens were questioning whether they're perfect. Societies were really as wonderful as they had been taught. On the Zephyrian research station, Emma White was amazed by the transformation she was witnessing. Scientists who had spent centuries following rigid protocols were now making breakthrough discoveries by combining ideas from completely different fields. One researcher had solved a long-standing physics problem by applying techniques from art and music theory. The Zephyrians were also beginning to form friendships and personal relationships that went beyond their assigned work groups. They started meeting informally to share ideas, and some even began creating art and poetry in their spare time. The station buzzed with an energy and excitement that had been absent for thousands of years. Ryan Scott reported similar changes at the crystalline mining operation. Workers who had been given the freedom to approach their tasks creatively were finding new mineral deposits and developing extraction techniques that were both more efficient and less environmentally damaging. More importantly, they were beginning to take pride in their work rather than simply following orders. Some crystallines had started decorating their living spaces with patterns and colors that appealed to them personally. Others began forming teams based on shared interests rather than genetic programming. The rigid hierarchy that had controlled their society for millions of years was gradually giving way to more flexible and dynamic relationships. Dr. Helen Carter faced the greatest challenges at the Hive Queen agricultural world, but was also seeing the most dramatic results. Individual drones were learning to make decisions about crop care based on their personal observations rather than waiting for instructions from the collective consciousness. This led to innovations in farming techniques that increased yields and improved crop quality. More significantly, some drones were beginning to form individual identities and personal relationships with beings from other species. They started asking questions about life beyond the hive and expressing curiosity about experiences they had never been allowed to have. A few even requested permission to leave the agricultural world and explore other careers. These developments terrified the traditional hive queens who saw individual consciousness as a form of mental illness that threatened the survival of their species. They petitioned the Federation to end the experiment immediately and demanded that the affected drones be returned to collective control through neural reconditioning. The situation reached a breaking point when delegates from the experimental colonies sent a joint message to the Federation Assembly. They announced that they no longer wished to return to their previous way of life and requested permission to continue operating under choice protocols. This was the first time in galactic history that individuals had challenged the authority of their own species' governments. War Commander Steel Talon declared this to be an act of rebellion that justified immediate military intervention. He accused the humans of deliberately corrupting loyal Federation citizens and turning them against their own people. His fleet moved to blockade positions around the experimental colonies while demanding that all human advisors surrender themselves for trial. Admiral Kevin Brooks arrived with the human fleet and took defensive positions around the colonies. For the first time in Federation history, two member species were preparing for armed conflict over fundamental principles of governance. The galaxy held its breath as the largest political crisis in millions of years threatened to tear the Federation apart. Jake Morrison found himself at the center of the storm, as both sides demanded that he choose between human principles and galactic peace. The experimental colonies were thriving beyond anyone's expectations, but their success had also triggered the greatest threat to human survival since the species had left Earth dot, as military fleets faced each other in space. Realized that the battle for individual choice had moved beyond the experimental colonies. Young beings throughout the galaxy were beginning to question the systems that controlled their lives, and some were demanding the right to make their own decisions about their futures. The one human law that had seemed so simple was now challenging. The foundation of galactic civilization and forcing every species to decide whether they valued security more than freedom, or whether they were willing to risk chaos in exchange for the possibility of growth and discovery. The two fleets faced each other in the cold darkness of space with weapons powered and shields raised. Admiral Kevin Brooks commanded the human forces, while War Commander Steel Talon led the Ferrum Coalition. Neither commander wanted to fire the first shot that would plunge the galaxy into its first war in millions of years, but both were prepared to defend their principles. On the surface of the experimental colony's beings, who had never known individual choice, were experiencing freedom. For the first time in their species' history, they watched the standoff in space and knew that their newfound autonomy hung in the balance. Many had sent messages to their home worlds, describing the joy of making personal decisions and pursuing individual interests. Emma White made a discovery that changed everything. While reviewing the Federation's historical archives, she found detailed records of the extinct civilizations that Lisa Grant had identified earlier. The archives contained not just basic information about these species, but complete records of their final years before they disappeared. Every extinct species had followed the same pattern. They had achieved perfect efficiency and eliminated all sources of chaos from their societies. But in doing so, they had also eliminated the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. When their environments shifted or new challenges arose, they could not innovate solutions because their rigid systems had no mechanisms for generating new ideas. Emma realized that the Federation was not just accidentally following a path to extinction, but was actively repeating the same mistakes that had killed hundreds of previous civilizations. The pursuit of perfect order was actually a form of slow suicide that destroyed species through stagnation rather than violence. She broadcast her findings to every ship in both fleets and to monitoring stations throughout the galaxy. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The Federation's perfect system was not sustainable and would eventually lead to the extinction of every species that followed it completely. The broadcast caused chaos in the Ferrum fleet as individual officers began questioning orders for the first time in their military careers. Some ships broke formation and refused to target the human vessels. War Commander Steel Talon found himself facing the same kind of individual choice rebellion that he had come to destroy. On Harmony, Prime Chancellor Vex 9 convened an emergency session of the Federation Assembly to address the crisis. Delegates who had spent their entire lives following rigid protocols were suddenly confronted with evidence that their way of life was fundamentally flawed and potentially deadly. Morrison spoke to the Assembly via holographic transmission from one of the experimental colonies. He stood beside representatives from all three colonies who had volunteered to address their former governments directly. For many species, this was the first time they had ever heard individuals speak for themselves rather than through official representatives. A young Zephyrian scientist named Melody 7 described the joy of pursuing her personal curiosity about how music might affect plant growth. Her research had led to discoveries that could revolutionize agriculture throughout the galaxy, but more importantly, it had given her a sense of purpose and excitement that she had never experienced under the old system. Crystal Worker Prime spoke for the mining colony and explained how individual creativity had led to more efficient and environmentally friendly extraction methods. He said that working alongside beings from other species had taught him that diversity of thought was more valuable than uniformity of action. Most powerfully, a Hive Queen drone who had chosen the name Liberty addressed the assembly as an individual, rather than as part of the collective consciousness. She described the wonder of forming personal friendships and making independent decisions about her own life. Her words sent shockwaves through the Hive Queen delegation because they had believed individual consciousness was impossible for their species. The evidence from the experimental colonies was undeniable. Innovation and productivity had increased dramatically once individuals were free to pursue their own interests and make their own decisions. The colonies were not descending into chaos, but were instead becoming more dynamic and successful than they had been under rigid control. Elder Sage Wisdom of Ages spoke for the Council of Ancient Races and admitted something that shocked the entire assembly. He revealed that his species had been slowly declining for millions of years, and that fewer new individuals were being born each generation. Their pursuit of perfect stability had led to a gradual loss of the life force itself. The elder said that watching the experimental colonies had reminded his people of what they had lost when they eliminated choice and change from their existence. Some of the ancient races were now considering whether they should try to rediscover the individual consciousness they had abandoned so long ago. The debate that followed was unlike anything in Federation history. For the first time, individual delegates began expressing personal opinions rather than simply representing their species' official positions. Some argued for maintaining the old ways, while others called for radical changes to the cosmic code. The turning point came when delegates from the experimental colonies announced that they would not return to their former way of life regardless of what the Federation decided. They said that having experienced individual choice, they could not go back to being programmed beings who never made personal decisions. This declaration forced every species to confront a fundamental question. Would they use force to compel compliance with laws that were proven to lead to extinction, or would they find the courage to change systems that had governed the galaxy for millions of years? War Commander Steel Talon made one final attempt: maintain the old order by ordering his fleet to attack the human vessels. But his own officers refused to obey, and several Ferrum ships actually moved to protect the colonies they had come to destroy. The military commander found himself facing a mutiny based on individual conscience rather than programmed obedience. Final vote was closer than anyone had expected. Species that had never experienced internal disagreement found themselves divided as individuals within their own ranks began asserting independent positions. The ancient systems of collective decision-making broke down as beings who had never thought for themselves began expressing personal opinions. The measure to protect individual choice throughout the galaxy passed by a single vote cast by a young Hive Queen drone who declared herself no longer bound by collective consciousness. Her decision sparked celebrations on the experimental colonies and inspired similar declarations of independence from beings throughout the Federation. The aftermath of the vote transformed galactic civilization more rapidly than anyone had anticipated. Species that had maintained rigid control for millions of years suddenly found themselves dealing with individuals who wanted to make their own choices about careers and relationships and personal goals. 5 years later, Jake Morrison stood in the renovated assembly hall of what was now called the Galactic Council of Individual Rights. The old Federation still existed, but it served to protect choice rather than eliminate it. Some species had adapted well to the changes, while others struggled with the transition from collective control to individual freedom. The galaxy was indeed more chaotic than before, but it was also more vibrant and dynamic. Scientific advancement had accelerated as individuals pursued passion projects across species lines. Art and culture flourished as beings discovered personal expression. New forms of cooperation emerged as individuals chose to work together based on shared interests rather than genetic programming. Emma White had established the Institute for Evolutionary Choice, where she continued studying how the freedom to make individual decisions led to better outcomes for entire civilizations. Her research suggested that the universe itself operated on principles of creative chaos rather than rigid order. As Jake looked out at the diverse assembly of individuals from hundreds of species, he reflected on how one simple human law had changed everything. The right to make personal choices, even when those choices seemed suboptimal, had proven to be the key to long-term survival and growth for any civilization. The human law that changed the universe was ultimately about more than just individual freedom. It was about the recognition that life itself required the ability to grow and change and adapt. Perfect order might seem safe and efficient, but it was actually a form of death disguised as success. The galaxy now looked forward to discovering new species and learning from their unique perspectives rather than trying to force them into existing patterns. For the first time in millions of years, the future was full of possibilities that no one could predict or control, and that uncertainty had become the source of hope rather than fear.